After completing this video, I decided to do a short introduction to go at the beginning, because I don't really want this video to be misunderstood. Basically, Farming Simulator 22, in comparison with Farming Simulator 19, supports manual transmissions, mostly in the tractors, obviously, but also in the trucks and the cars and so on. And it's a cool add-on. It's one of the most significant advances of it, along with a lot of other things like seasons and additional crops and all kinds of really realistic, really cool stuff, even down to the point where you can go day by day in real time, which is crazy. So it's an amazing expansion of Farming Simulator 22, but I wanted to point out that the add-on makers are having a little bit of trouble with the manual transmissions, because I think the way that Giant Software have implemented it has been a little bit confusing. I think if they had had better documentation, it would have worked better. Now, what I did was I experimented a bit with trying to correct the torque curves and the transmissions on a few of the add-on vehicles, especially cars. And I picked one example, which I'm not really trying to criticize particularly, because I think that in general this problem is at Giant's end. I think they could have documented this better. Now, all of this could prove irrelevant this fall when they release Farming Simulator 25. Because 25 is a completely new game engine, and it might be that a lot of this stuff is no longer going to be relevant once that version of the Farming Simulator comes out. And I'm actually eager to see it. It should be really impressive. Now, whether I'm going to see it on sale in time to do a timely review is another story, because I don't burn a huge amount of money on these things. I got Farming Simulator 22 when it was on sale, if I'm being honest. But yeah, I didn't want this video to come across as really negative, because I actually really like Farming Simulator 22. I actually found it a little bit easier to mod than Farming Simulator 19 overall. Maybe because the documentation is a little bit better and people have more experience with it generally, so plenty of people ask for advice online. But I just wanted to be clear that I'm trying to give some tips on how the torque curve and the transmissions could be configured a little bit better. I'm not really trying to lean on anybody too hard. I think that also this is, again, going to be probably immaterial in another month. Anyway, enjoy the video. About a year ago, I did a playthrough of Farming Simulator 19 right here. And this is still enormously popular, even though it's 2 versions ago now of Farming Simulator, and it looks as if you can still buy it off the Farming Simulator website, which is really run by Giant's Software, with all of these associated companies that I guess they have endorsements from. These are manufacturers of real farming equipment. So there's social media and so on and so forth, but Giant Software is the actual company publishing this, and it's atypical in a lot of ways. I'm very surprised that I like this game so much. As I've said before, it's one of my favorite games, even though I've never been a farmer in real life and never really had any aspiration to be a farmer. But I think the technological side of it is fun. I think the business side of it is fun. So it has a lot of things for a lot of people. Just recently, I finally got around to getting Farming Simulator 22, which is no longer the current version in development, but it is the newest version that's for sale as of this recording. And they just were doing a big sale on Steam, and so I thought I will save some money and finally get this, regardless of whether or not I play it a lot. There are a few changes that I noticed right away with it, though. 25, which is the new version they're going to release pretty soon, which is already available for pre-order, has a whole bunch of additional expansions. But my sense is the real leap in realism and features is the leap from 19 to 22. Because 19 was only an incremental improvement on the previous versions of the game. 22 actually has some meaningful changes, like the introduction of seasons native to the game as opposed to through an add-on. And actual months instead of just weeks. which of course are related to the seasonal cycles, as they're saying. They have production chains added natively. Another thing they're not mentioning is that with the change of seasons, there are authentic limits now, as of 22, for when you can grow certain crops, because in real life, you can't grow any crop at any time of year, especially in a temperate climate. So that's an additional, very serious increase in realism. And they say new maps, crops, machines, brands, and more. They've actually cut a bunch of maps, cut a bunch of machines, cut a bunch of brands. I've found that through the add-ons that you can get online, you can more or less replace those. There are a few exceptions, but mostly you can. And I'm going to do a full playthrough of 22 once I get further into it to compare it to 19. And I'll be behind the curve, of course, because 25 will probably be out by the time I do that. I'll probably get 25 as well eventually, but I always buy stuff on sale unless somebody offers me something free. So I'm going to focus on a particular aspect of the modding done for 22, in addition to something I should note, which is it doesn't appear that as many mods have been made for 22 as for 19. It seems that 19 was much more popular with modders for reasons which are not 100% sure to me, because for some reason I find 22 to be easier to mod, because I've never done modding of Farming Simulator 19. But 22, I did my first mod about a day ago, which is done before I've even played the game with any seriousness. I have not done anything but a few introductory sessions with Farming Simulator 22 since getting it. I don't have all the DLCs yet. I only have, of course, a handful of even the small number of add-ons that are available. I've found that maybe about half of the add-ons available online are defective even, but I'll get into that because there's a key thing that's introduced in Farming Simulator 2 compared to 19, which is maybe not so significant for gameplay, but seems to have negatively impacted some of the mods, at least of vehicles. And that newly introduced feature is not listed here. Namely, the vehicles now are available if you choose to offer them with it. You can offer the vehicles now with manual transmissions. So when you have a vintage tractor like this one, you can put a real manual transmission in it with actual ratios which are in the XML file that give you the physics, or rather give the game the physics for each vehicle. So it adds an extra level of realism to a game that in 19 at least was a little bit gamey, as one of my old friends used to say. It's billed as a simulator, but it has a lot of shortcuts when it comes to realism. 22 attempts to simulate the vehicles in a slightly more realistic manner than 19, even though there are some key omissions. And the transmission is one step in that direction. I'll now demonstrate what this entails and what I've done. This is not Farming Simulator. This is Car Mechanic Simulator from Playway, one of my favorite games, even though I've never done a proper playthrough of it. Car Mechanic Simulator is useful for us purposes because it allows me to show how to set up gear ratios on a manual transmission. Now, one of the things about Car Mechanic Simulator is that you can't change the ratios on an existing transmission unless it's a racing transmission, which is maybe even more liberal than real life, because actually in real life, if you want to change the ratios of a transmission or a differential, you generally change the whole thing. That's typically how you do it, but in Car Mechanic Simulator, if you're using a racing transmission, you can change not only the ratios of the transmission, but also the differential. In this case, we have the engine, the transmission there that I'm pointing to. The engine's in front of it. You can see the oil pan there. And then behind the transmission is the drive shaft going back to the differential. The differential actually determines the top speed of the car, assuming you have enough horsepower to spin it all the way up to top RPM, or close to the top red line RPM. Inside, it's full of oil typically, which periodically you have to change. So you remove the back cover, and mechanics I've known in real life typically lower the car a bit more than for a regular oil change to make less of a mess. Because there's no drain plug usually. Transmission, of course, you would drain the fluid normally, but they haven't simulated that in Car Mechanic Simulator just yet. So we're going to skip that part. So I'm going to remove the drive shaft here. Fake WD-40 there to loosen a rusted bolt. As I've said, I enjoy this game quite a lot too, even though it's not the point of this playthrough. I'm just using it because I don't have a real car to show you. And a real car would be a little bit harder to demonstrate this, actually, because I'd have to show you all the measurements with a caliper, and it would be maybe a little bit harder to grasp. So we'll pull this stock transmission off. We'll put the racing transmission on. There's the clutch assembly. We're not going to mess with that right now. So I'll put on the racing transmission that allows us to fiddle to a degree you probably couldn't in real life. Not with most racing transmissions, anyway. Put the starter back on. Put the drive shaft back on. Now what you'll see is we'll also be able to fiddle with the differential, which is also kind of unrealistic. But it enables us to look at gear ratios in general on a car. So we'll take the car to the dyno station. Not that this is, again, necessarily how you would do this, but it assumes that every car has chips that you can reprogram, even if it's a car that's much too old to have them. We'll go to the laptop. There are our ratios. The top ratio, or final ratio, is the differential. It's 3 here, which is actually pretty fast, actually. So I'll slow it down to 411. Bigger gear ratio for more grip and more power, even if it's a lower top speed in the end. These ratios are for the transmission. It's a 4-speed, of course, because it's a vintage muscle car. Actually a fictional one. Supposedly this is based on the 1969 Pontiac GTO, but it's not an exact copy. It's basically inspired by it. So I'm changing these ratios to a vintage Muncie M22 Rock Crusher transmission. Those are authentic ratios for a rock crusher. And you notice the top gear has a ratio of 1, which means it's directly the same as the RPM of the crankshaft. The larger numbers mean that it's slower than the RPM of the crankshaft. So as a result, the top gear gives us our top speed. And if I make the gear ratio on the differential smaller, the top speed goes up, not down. Up to 131 in this case, which is a nice muscle car top speed. They have a little bit of trouble handling over that speed, so we'll leave it at 131. I'll take it to the drag strip and do a full mile rather than a quarter. Now here I wanted to demonstrate how you go through the gears pretty smoothly if you have a transmission set up nicely. And the Muncie M22 was considered a pretty nice transmission back in the day, so you can see the gears shift at about the right moment. If you run the engine up close to red line and then throw it into the next gear. We're in top gear now, so it should top out, but actually I know from experience that we're going to run out of drag strip here. So it will top out at 129 and not 131. So there we go. We've completed our pass. It does give us our quarter-mile time. That's not an amazing time. It's not a terrible time either. 14.8 seconds, 97 miles an hour at the trap. And the 0 to 60, I know for this car, is typically around 6.4 seconds. So again, muscle car speeds, not supercar speeds. In that case, I got 6.5. So, what happens if we try a truck? Well, trucks typically have a larger gear ratio for even more grip. So we'll use a Land Rover here, Land Rover Defender. These are popular not just as SUVs, but as proper UVs, especially with British farmers, and the British military use them too. And this is an actual authentic reproduction of the Land Rover Defender, because Land Rover officially endorsed Car Mechanic's take on it here, so we should assume this is reasonably authentic. But I'm going to pull the transmission anyway so we can actually see the ratios. And I'm actually going to give this Land Rover an M22 also, so that we're a little bit more scientific, even though I don't think they ever had M22s in real life. M22s are mostly associated with General Motors cars. And back in the 60s, even though Land Rovers got their parts from various sources, they tended to be British automakers. So we remove the drive shafts, which it has 2 of because it's a 4x4. Remove the transfer case, which again it has because it's a 4x4. Pull the starting motor again. Pull the stock transmission out. Put the racing transmission in, again leaving the clutch alone. Put the starter back on. And the transfer case. The drive shafts for the front and for the rear. And we're off to the dyno again, once we have that all settled. Alright, so we let it down. I have to get it moved here. Okay, so we set up the ratios again. I'm going to show you the original differential. Note that the TBX had 3. This one has 4.29, so it's actually even heavier than 411, which I had experimented with as a heavy gear ratio for the TBX. And we see it has a 6-speed transmission in this case because it's a relatively modern version of the Defender. I'm going to, as I said, knock this back to 4 gears to make it basically comparable to a Muncie M22 with the same ratios. So 2.2 for first gear. So 2.2. Well, really, we're being honest. Less than half the RPM of the crank. And then the top gear is the RPM of the crank. And it gives us a top speed of only 94 miles an hour, which is actually perfectly adequate for a utility vehicle, and if anything, is overkill. But I want to demonstrate how that works. You have a 4-wheel drive vehicle here. It has trouble launching because the wheels can't spin easily, not to mention the fact that we have a much lower horsepower rating and torque rating on this 4-cylinder engine than on the V8 and the TBX. But that's not the point. Notice how the gears more or less go through their cycles once the vehicle is launched. It doesn't struggle at all, doesn't buck, because this transmission is designed to be a heavy-duty transmission. And the 4.29 differential ratio is pretty much fine for a truck. And you could actually put a heavier differential in this vehicle and it would still probably be fine. Might even be better. Now it is a much slower vehicle, but that's just as much because of lower horsepower and lower torque as it is the gearing. I mean, the gearing, if anything, makes it a bit quicker. Now, on to tractors in Farming Simulator. Here we got a quarter-mile time of 21 seconds, which is kind of slow, 66 miles an hour. A tractor wouldn't even make 66. Might even have trouble making 30. But in the 17 seconds 0 to 60 time, which is like a Volkswagen Beetle. But the point is, I want to move on to tractors now, before I waste any more time on this. So this is the Ravenport map in Farming Simulator 19. It's the most basic map that you can do the tutorial on, set in California. And the farmhouse is actually reasonably detailed. You can walk into it, which is nice. Although the door doesn't operate, the door just stays open. And there isn't a whole lot you can do in there except sleep. The other buildings are mostly dummies, so this garage here, these doors don't open. So it's basically useless. It's just scenery. There's an argument against the new farmer feature because you get this land taken up by these buildings and you can't really use them for anything. That's the thing. You do get a nice selection of farming implements and so on, but there are questionable aspects to this setup. There's a Bentley, which is not part of the original game. I'm going to use that to demonstrate some of the simulation features in a minute. That silo there does work, but it's not what I'm going to demonstrate. I'm going to try to demonstrate this tractor here, this Fiat 1300, which is one of the most basic tractors in the game. Comes with the default game. You don't have to get any add-ons to use it. And the various levers are simulated accurately. If you want to hook up to the trailer here, the Stratman SEK 802, which is mostly for transporting grain, you can do that with the Q key. You can use the W key to go forward, although you can also use the controller if you have one. So we will ease it forward a little bit here. See? You don't have to shift any gears, it just does it automatically, and if you press another button, you can get it to go into reverse, which also serves as your brake. So it's a very, very simple, very, very gamey setup. And the beauty of Farming Simulator 19 is that it is very simple. Very easy to learn. Although doing well in it, of course, is a challenge. But it's an example of how everything is very simplified. There's only one gear, notice. They haven't simulated even an automatic transmission in this. And the real tractor would have a manual transmission. So, if I stop, and then I accelerate again, you could see there's no shifting going on at all. It's as if this is an electric tractor, even though it's not. So then the question is, what happens if we try something faster? If I get out of this tractor here and get into this Bentley, which is an add-on car, admittedly, and I try to do a little bit of stupid joyriding in it to get it going fast. First I have to get it to a place where I can really open it up here. The steering is very, very jumpy. I think that I'm going to make some adjustments on this for subsequent parts of this video. Getting the steering calibrated correctly isn't really a matter of the model so much as just how you have your game set up. And I seem to have not got this set up correctly. I'm trying a new computer here and it's just not calibrated the way it should be. But if I take it easy, I can drive this thing. This is more or less what it's like. Only one gear. Although some of these vehicles, the more advanced ones, have automatic transmissions with more than one gear. In this case, though, if I jump over to the control sensitivity, there's no option, of course, for manual transmission because this is Farming Simulator 19. The steering sensitivity appears to be set correctly, which annoys me a little bit because I'm not sure how to resolve it. It might be that I'm missing something, because I had this working pretty well on my other computer. This computer should really do better than this, but I'm only going to do a brief demonstration of this, so hopefully it's not going to be too bad. I'll show how to do this in Farming Simulator 22 also, which is a little bit more sophisticated than this. But let's try it as it is, see how it works. If I take the car up into town and try to find a straight stretch of road, you can see it's very, very awkward. This is not all the transmission. As I said, this is largely the steering not really being calibrated perfectly. Basically too responsive or under-responsive at the same time. Stop sign, let's try to do this realistically here. I do like how the pedals are animated in this model. I really have no objections to how this is modeled in Farming Simulator 19. I think this is one of the nicer cars that you can get, even if it is kind of over the top. I don't think too many farmers have Bentleys. But we find a road over here. This road is a little bit faster. Sometimes I do speed runs on it, but it's not in the sense of fast gameplay, but in the sense of fast driving for testing. Let's see if it works. I'll try to get it up to speed here. Demonstrate a few things about Farming Simulator 19. Some of this is just review, of course, but I wanted to show, say if I accelerate up to highway speed here, I can get a straight shot here. See, the steering is horrible on this. I'm gonna start driving stupidly about now. Pass this person illegally. And then you accelerate. And the car is pretty fast, actually, realistically. And I lose it realistically. Maybe even more harshly than in real life, because it's a pretty large tired car. One thing you do notice is that if I crash it, it doesn't really take any acute damage. All the damage in Farming Simulator 19 is wear and tear, which appears to have been carried over into 22. I'm going to investigate further to see if I'm not at the full realism level, but it looks as if 22 also has a very wear and tear based damage model without any damage you can incur by crashing the vehicle. But you can see it gets a little bit sluggish around 100 miles an hour here, and now I lose it again, which probably isn't realistic for a Bentley. If I try a Volkswagen Beetle, this is another add-on car. This is one of my favorites from AW Modding there. This one's easier to drive, actually, even with a poorly calibrated controller. It may have been that this modder did a little bit more testing with a range of controllers, or it might just be that the car is slower, which it is. It's unrealistically slow, actually. It doesn't have to matter so much in Farming Simulator because fast driving is actually rather difficult. But it still doesn't really have a realistic transmission. You don't shift manually, because that is not a feature in Farming Simulator 19. And if you look at the acceleration, it is more or less as if it were electric. Basically, it has only one gear, even if crude attempts are made with the sound to make it sound like it's more than one gear, it really isn't. Now, maybe there are supposed to be multiple gears that aren't really functioning on this model, but it appears to be only one gear. I can say that as the mods go for Farming Simulator 19, this is a better running car than the Bentley. Even though the Bentley might look a little bit nicer, although I really like the look of both of these. This one doesn't have the animated pedals by appearances. But see, this tops out at about 44 miles an hour, which is not realistic, because a real Beetle, even a relatively old one, tops out at closer to 70, or a little more. Slow, but not that slow. It might be that they confused kilometers per hour with miles per hour. Anyway. Is there anything more to see here? As you can see, it handles a lot better simply because it seems to work better with the game control of Farming Simulator. So this is the Elm Creek map, which is the default map in Farming Simulator 22. The farmhouse is less detailed than in Ravenport. However, in spite of the fact that you can't get into it, and it being basically a sleep trigger and nothing much else, even it looks nice from the outside, the other buildings are much more functional. All of these buildings are usable. with the exception of one, which I'll show in a bit. So you have this garage here with inspection pits. There's no repair trigger, but you can add it with add-ons. The silo in the barn doesn't work either, but again, you can add it. And you have a separate silo that does work. And there is the barn, which I think is really nice. It has a basement, and in addition to that, it has 2 floors up also. And there's a silo there. As I said, it's non-functional, but you can fix that. You also get, by default, this well here, which in Farming Simulator 19 would be optional. But you get it with the new farmer setup in Elm Creek. And then over here, there's the building that you can't really use, although there's that trigger there for the help menu. One improvement from 19 is that all of these are removable. In 19, there were a number of obstacles that simply were unremovable without the Giants editor, and you basically had to create a custom map. There's the help menu, as I said. That should give you water, but it looks like it doesn't. That's annoying, but more generally speaking, this is a really nice map. See, the doors don't open. And it doesn't matter which one. A lot of the buildings are dummies, actually, in this map. Which I guess is understandable because it's the most default, most crude map in the game. Just that an awful lot of games have moved on from these dummy buildings stuff at this point. Anyway, this isn't really why I'm doing this video. I will hopefully do a playthrough of Farming Simulator 22 once I have a little bit more experience with it. Here I'm only going to focus on the new manual transmission feature. So here we have a Massey Ferguson 3670, more or less a vintage tractor at this point. And for that reason, it has a manual transmission. And so that D there indicates gear group D. I'll get to that in a second. It doesn't indicate D on an automatic transmission. This is manual shift. So if I put it in first gear, it will give me first gear of group D. This actually has A, B, C, and D groups. A is the slowest, D is the fastest. So also I should note how you switch gear groups. I have the shifter set up on my controller, but I don't have the gear groups. We'll go down here under keyboard controls and see how that works. There are a lot of heavy trucks that have this feature of gear groups also, so that you can have many speeds for heavy loads. That way you can have very low gears for speeds under 5 miles an hour, which sounds a little bit crazy, but if you have limited horsepower for your load, it can be quite practical. So here I've set up keypad 9 and 7 for shifting the gear groups, which is actually the default. And number pad plus and minus for shifting up and down within those gears. Although, as I said, I'm using a joystick here. You can see me shifting through the gear groups there to demonstrate that feature. I'll go into A1 here. Give it a try. I will couple this wagon on. Actually, some of the wagons and implements require a 2-step process for coupling, but this one appears to be only 1 step. You just hit the Q key, just like in Farming Simulator 19. So if I ease it forward a little bit, it will not be fast. There, it's in red line, it's only 5 miles an hour, and if I shift up a bit, it's barely any more than that. But this would be very useful if I had a heavy load. If I switch to group B, it's faster. Notice. In fact, it was so jumpy I had to hold it back. Now if I shift back to D, this tractor has so much torque I can actually start it from 4th gear. But this theoretically should be difficult for the tractor actually. But D is the fastest group for this tractor. And I could actually take it on the road with this speed. Although I have a few more things I want to show you. This tractor actually runs very well in manual transmission mode, if you activate the feature. And that's not really my complaint. My complaint is more that it seems a lot of the add-on vehicles aren't as well made. Maybe because the documentation provided by Giant Software hasn't been complete enough or clear enough. I'm going to attempt to show how to fix the ratios in this video. But first I'll do a little bit more demonstration to illustrate my point. So if I go back to the garage here, in this map, a working garage, there's this pickup truck here, which appears to be a fictionalized version of a 1986 Dodge Dakota. Also over on the left here is a John Deere tractor of roughly the same vintage, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not an expert on John Deere. But it's 4755, which also has a manual transmission. I'm not going to demonstrate that here, though. But it's some cool old equipment here anyway that they start you with. So there's fun factor even in the beginning of the game. But there's our sort of fake Dodge Dakota. I think that's what it's supposed to be. And if I get in it, it also has a manual transmission, but it only has one gear group because it's just a pickup truck. So if I shift it into gear here, it will more or less behave normally. I think that Giants built this one fairly well too. It is also a default vehicle, and it seems to run quite well actually. I'm fiddling with it a little bit here because my controls are really, again, not behaving the way I wanted them to throughout this experimentation. The visibility here is kind of bad too. I will attempt to turn in here. And oops, that didn't work out so well. I did manage to avoid an accident though. So if I speed up here, the pickup truck unrealistically has 6 gears. 1986, pretty much nothing had 6 gears. But it's a fictionalized truck. And my control is terrible. I'm swerving all over the place here. If I turn in up here, this is the shop where you buy all your equipment. And I have already leased the Porsche 911 Turbo S there. That's an add-on car. I'm not going to name the developer because I'm going to be criticizing it a bit. I think that as a model, it's absolutely beautiful. And so, actually, I would go a step further. I would say it's the best Porsche model that isn't electric in Farming Simulator 22. So there's really, relative to Porsches in Farming Simulator 22, this is a very nice model. Very nice interior, which you don't always see. Some of the other models are actually kind of bad. This interior is just fine. And the directionals work very realistically, just like the real thing, as you can see there. The regular lights, if I switch them on, I have low beam and high beam, realistically. So that's fine. Get in, and the interior lights work just fine. Also very nice. So if I take this car out on the road, it works more or less. So if I shift it into first gear, this theoretically is a transmission you can run in auto or manual, but really your controls for that are in Farming Simulator and not in the car, if I understand correctly. If you have manual transmissions activated, this will be a manual. So here I take it out on the road. My steering is still terrible, again, because of the settings. And that's really behaving strangely. See how it'll be sluggish until the top of the RPM, and then it'll suddenly jump, like really violently like that. Which I've found is the case with a number of these vehicles. And it results in pretty good performance, but very sloppy behavior, let's say. And the reason for that is I found that the ratios are wrong. So here I'll do a little bit more demonstration driving here. See if I can get the car into a K-turn here. This one has only one reverse gear, which is realistic. A number of the tractors and trucks have more than one, which as far as I know is prototypical because tractors and trucks sometimes have a need to get extra power going backwards. They're obviously not the same kinds of vehicles as cars are, especially not sports cars. But again, the ratio makes this car behave strangely and unrealistically, which is unfortunate because more generally this is an excellent model. Really nothing wrong with it as far as I can tell beyond this. And I think this is just because the documentation is not very good. Again, I crashed it there, and it looks as if the damage model again is wear and tear only in this version of Farming Simulator. There may be a more sophisticated damage model to turn on, but as I experiment with the game more, I'll let you know. Or maybe you'll find out for yourself. So see, the car is pretty fast. But it's weird, let's say. I'll pull in here and then we'll try fixing this problem. This XML file shows the engineering data for that car. And we can see some things that are understandable. I haven't learned all these yet because, for example, lifetime. I don't know if that's the total lifetime of the vehicle or the total lifetime in wear and tear before you have to rebuild it. But I was more interested in how they simulated gear ratios. So if I go down here, it takes a while to get down to it. Here they have the differential configuration. Actually, this car would have more than one because it's basically a four-wheel drive car. So these are the maximum speed ratios. I consulted several sources about why these differ, and my understanding is this has more to do with the transfer case and the way that four-wheel drive is distributed, rather than the differential ratio. If we move down here, we have the engine configuration, and it isn't entirely clear whether this specification here has any effect or whether the horsepower has any effect. This probably does. So this is the proportion of torque you get at each RPM level. This isn't perfectly uniform, but it's probably based on specifications that the author found. And the transmission then has its ratios, these gear ratios for each one. One of the things that's a little bit, actually no, here it is, here's the answer, backward gear. So this indicates that R is a reverse gear. And these are the forward gears, of course. It has 7 speeds, which is prototypically accurate. This here doesn't really matter very much within the game. This is simply what they call it in the game. I'm not 100% sure if this axle ratio is really relevant. But the point is, this is probably the reason for its patchy performance. You're going to say, well, why? Well, here, first of all, is the actual torque curve, which doesn't really match. But just as importantly, the gear ratios don't match. We can find them. Actually, so there we go, all-wheel drive. The horsepower rating, as I said before, is higher than they're saying it is, but the ratios don't match. Check this out. First gear should be 3.91, and here it's 4.066, and so on down the line. All of them are wrong. Even the reverse is wrong, actually. And the differential is also wrong, which is probably the reason. Let's see. Now, with the limitations of Farming Simulator, you can't really fix this easily. The car will not perform as well as it would in a proper car simulator like Assetto Corsa. But you can make this run a lot more smoothly, and this applies to a lot of other vehicles too. I've fixed several vehicles, getting them back up to where they should be performing by simply fixing either the ratios or the RPMs, because these RPMs are also probably too low. This is really the RPM where you hit peak power on a 911 of that year. It's not the actual maximum RPM, and that limits your performance very considerably, actually. So here's what I did. So anyway, this is my attempt at a fix. This is just scrolled right to where I don't want it. Just was in the right position, and now it's not. Here we go. All right, so there's the original set of settings. And here's my correction. I made the torque curve much more in line with the official specifications, of course. That's one change. This is proportional to this, which is basically the real torque run through an algorithm to create this number. I found that a lot of the information online about this is inaccurate, or at least contradictory and confusing, so anybody who can clarify it would be welcome. And then I changed the RPM. I corrected the forward speed, although it didn't have to be changed by very much. And then the gear ratios are now correct. Now the axle ratio is there. Initially I didn't get that to work, and I don't know why. These are not the correct ratios for real life, but actually what this is proportionate to the wheel sets. I'm not 100% sure how that works, but I've found that other developers leave that alone and that the ratio is actually adjusted here. And this other stuff is a little bit subjective. This is, I think, only for the store. I don't think that has anything to do with anything. And otherwise, I didn't change very much. I corrected the horsepower also, which meant correcting the torque, but that was already settled. So I will now do a test drive of the corrected car. I am struggling a little bit today because my joystick is not working right. Previously, when I did test runs of this car, I had problems with calibration of the game, and today it's calibration of the joystick, so we'll see how it goes. So before I demonstrate the car, I'll demonstrate how to set up your controller. I actually had more trouble with the controller than I did with the game itself this time around. This calibration is necessary, but it didn't really resolve anything. I have the general settings here, which don't include controller settings. The display settings are the next one down. The keyboard controls do not include the controller, even though you see the mouse pictured there. You want to go to the bottom there and switch your device over to whatever controller you're using, because the default is the mouse and it won't show you the other ones. And I've reduced the sensitivity of the x-axis to 50% and left everything else at 100. That seems to work the best. So if we move on to the actual car here, this is the new and improved Porsche 911. Basically only improved with a slight engine tweak and a more considerable transmission tweak that I showed earlier. This is already starting to show the dirt model because I've been testing it quite a lot. Took a number of attempts to get this right. My joystick is pulling to the right, so I have to figure out what's causing that. I think maybe bad contacts, possibly. It's not that old, it's only like a couple of years old, and my old joystick I used it to replace was 10 years old, so, or over 10 years old, really. So we'll have to see. Anyway, I sort of am able to hold the car on the road. It pulls to the right a little bit, as you can see, so I'm wobbling around a little, having to hold the car back, but it's going 90. So it's certainly as fast as it's supposed to be, because I didn't even try to drive it that fast. So see if I can get it turned around down here. This map is really not very big, which stands to reason because it's the default map. But fast driving is challenging if for no other reason that you don't have enough room to get up to speed. So that was another mild headache in doing this. I haven't been able to take this car up to top speed, which is almost 200 miles an hour. But 130? It'll do 130 on this map. So swerve around this other vehicle here. And I'm almost at the end of the map, and boom, there we are. And again, no acute damage. I think I've maybe found evidence of an acute damage model in the game engine, but I haven't been able to figure out a way to switch it on. I'm going to have to experiment more. But as I said earlier, this car is showing a little bit of wear and tear and a little bit of dirt. So those features are working. I will also demonstrate some donuts here, because it is realistic enough to execute them properly, but as you'll see, it gets the skid marks right and handles quite nicely, even though my joystick is not cooperating 100%. But it doesn't squeal. So I guess they never added tire squeal because they presumed you'll be driving tractors around in the mud and you won't get any tire squeal. Might get only limited tire squeal if you take it on the road. But they have the capacity to add it, so we'll see if it's included in Farming Simulator 25. My directional is still stuck on there. I think maybe the next thing would be to see how hard it is to park this thing. Just throwing around a little bit here to see if there's anything else I can discover. And I think a parking test, maybe my final test of the day here. See how hard it is to do. So far, so good. It's cooperating with me very nicely. If I pull in next to the pickup truck here, maybe I'll get it lined up just right. Yeah. In some ways it's better than the real thing because I can see out of the vehicle perfectly. There's my joystick jiggling the wheel again, that's not me. There we go. Okay, so I guess that's it. And I'm going to do a lot more experimentation with this game. I am finding it about as interesting as everybody else is, even though now it's going to be obsolete in a few weeks, probably. But it is a whole other game from Farming Simulator 19, which might be why Giant Software are still selling the old one. Maybe some people prefer it still. You can see the dirt on the tires there. But I was going to conclude here originally, but I have one more thing I want to show you. So, demonstrating my point here, here's the AWM Beetle from before. Still one of my favorite Farming Simulator cars ever. And I fixed the transmission in this one too, but watch what happens. This is an important detail. First of all, the sound doesn't work. That's a whole separate discussion. I'm not going to get into that right now. That's a separate video. But we pull out onto the road here. I'm in first gear. And accelerate using button 1 on my joystick as I've configured it. And it struggles and it struggles. And kind of levels out at 36 miles an hour. I figured out that my joystick is set up to be only 50% sensitive, so I have to use the keyboard to get full throttle, which I didn't realize before. But the car will go the full 70 miles an hour now with my corrections of the torque and the gears. The problem is, if I try to shift it, we're up at 70, I should easily be able to shift up here because I'm actually at top speed, and it actually drops the speed. So it could be said that the torque still doesn't work correctly, so everything I've said on the video so far could also be sort of irrelevant because of the flaws in the engine. So that's just the one little disclaimer I wanted to throw in there. It's basically optimized for diesels and not for petrol. So, in any case, thanks for watching.